We don't know who the ancient megalithic builders were. Were they so-called Atlanteans? Were they aliens? Were they an unknown culture that simply disappeared? That is something that we are presently working on. So this again shows you quite clear evidence that the columns themselves, all 300 of them in granite, were turned on ancient lathes. We don't actually have this technology today, or if we do, it's very recent, and there is no way they could have been made by the Romans. Okay, welcome to Petra. And Petra is located in Jordan, and most of you will have heard of Petra from one of the Indiana Jones films, but it's far more complicated and far larger than you could possibly imagine unless you've been there. So just after you walk through the gates, you see all of these recesses and chambers carved into the bedrock. And I was very lucky to have with me a geologist from Canada. And so most of the archaeologists and other scholars say that the material here is sandstone bedrock. And when the geologist Susan inspected more carefully, she found out that it's actually quartzite. And quartzite is 7 out of 10 hardness, with diamond being 10. So that means the shaping of the stone surfaces at Petra would require, at minimum, hardened steel. The culture that supposedly constructed all of this was called the Nabateans, and they occupied this area somewhere between 100 BC and 100 AD. But when you see the extensive nature of the construction and work at Petra, there's no way that these Arabic people could have done the work. They obviously arrived in Petra and found it abandoned, and then they did a little bit of ornamentation work. But there's no way that they constructed Petra, because Petra is 12 kilometers or 7 miles long. So we see facade after facade cut into the bedrock. We also see weathering, which is not consistent with Petra being 2,000 years old. So it could very well be much, much older than that. And it's the sheer scale of Petra that is most intriguing. We found channels that were carved into the quartzite bedrock on the left side and the right side. And some of the damage to these channels is so extensive that that's what made me start to think that it's much, much older than what is commonly believed, and was found by the Nabatean people, who then conducted some repair work. And then here you can see the original area or part on the foreground, and then in the background you see repair work that was done probably by the Nabateans or soon after by the Romans. Now this is the famous treasury, and most people think that this is all that Petra is, but the treasury is 1% of what Petra is. And the fine carving that you see being done, I think, was done during Nabatean times. Because they were very successful trading people, I think they were able to bring sculptors, possibly from Greece, to do the fine ornamentation work, but the original facade and the chambers inside are original. You're not allowed to go inside that chamber anymore, but those that were able to in the past did measurements, and that chamber is 300,000 cubic feet in size. And there's another one below it in a subterranean structure, and it also is 300,000 cubic feet in size. When you look at the back wall at Petra, I think we're looking at machine marks. So we're looking at an ancient place that was made not using steel chisels by hundreds of people, but by lost ancient high technology of some kind. And again, the weathering indicates that it is several thousand years old. So that's what's important to state. And if you look on the right-hand side and the left, you can see these little niches cut into the surface. I think that was done by the Greek sculptors as a way to get up to the top of the treasury and do the ornamental carving that was done. And then here, again, I think these surfaces in the background show evidence of ancient machine marks, and the weathering of this quartzite is very suspicious. There are also darkened areas that appear to have been struck by ancient high heat in the distant past. And if it's the same as what we see in places like Egypt and the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, Petra could have been struck by a cataclysmic series of events some 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. There are so many chambers cut into this quartzite bedrock that it's just almost surreal to look at. Again, you're looking at a huge chamber that could house several vehicles, just to give a sense of scale. And how much time would that have taken by a number of people with steel chisels to do that? And what would its original function have been? It's being used as nothing presently. As we just keep walking along, the more the wonderment continues. And again, some of the weathering on the surfaces, I think, is much older than 2,000 years. And again, the darkened surfaces could very well be ancient heat scorching of some kind. Possibly, as Dr. Robert Schoch would say, plasma ejection from the sun around 12,000 years ago. And we just keep walking, and more and more and more. And notice that these surfaces are quite crude compared to the treasury. And so that's why I suspect that specialists were brought in, likely Greeks, to do the ornamentation, the fine work at the treasury, but they didn't have the resources or finances to be able to do the entire area, because that would take a long time, and Petra is 7 miles or 12 kilometers long. And again, look at the extent of the weathering. Quartzite being 7 out of 10 is very hard. It's almost it's glass-like hard, if not harder. And you see all the pock marks in the stone, and ancient simple-looking carving that has fallen off over the course of time, and the different coloration. Some of that is the natural bedrock, but other could be very much scorching of ancient heat. And especially look at the weathering here on this side and inside there, and relatively intact. This could be water weathering from flash floods happening over the course of thousands of years. That too is a possibility, because Petra does get flash flooding still on occasion. This whole surface here is part of what was an ancient river system, seasonal, and the Nabateans were actually experts in terms of controlling water management. So when they arrived in the area, they were able to develop a system of dams in order to hold the water back, and that became one of their industries. They sold water to people of the general area on a commercial basis. Chamber after chamber after chamber after chamber. Our guide was a local person who kept insisting that the Nabateans, who were a nomadic people of Arab extraction, that they were the ones who did all of this work. And I kept saying that's impossible, because of all of my extensive travels through different countries looking specifically at lost ancient high technology. So I guess my eye has developed to the point where I can easily see the difference between what can be done with hand tools and what can't be. And the sheer sense of scale at Petra indicates a deep antiquity and also the clear presence of very advanced machining technology. So these were used as tombs, but it's the same thing that we find in Egypt. Just because something was used as a tomb or even a dwelling doesn't mean that that was the original function, and it doesn't mean that the people who used them as tombs or dwellings were the ones who constructed them in the first place. Because in Egypt, a lot of the tombs where the pharaohs were buried were not made by the pharaohs, but were found by them. The dynastic people found major underground complexes in Egypt, such as the Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens, and utilized them as tombs, but they did not make them in the first place. It's a lot easier to use something that's already there than try to construct them. And then we have some columns. So the 3 columns on the right are in the bedrock itself. They were carved out of the bedrock surface. The 2 on the left are repair work, likely done during the Nabatean or the Roman period. And so the Nabateans and Romans did work like sectional work of making columns, and you'll see that throughout the Roman world. All the columns are made of sections, whereas the earlier work is the solid bedrock. And that's also something that we see in ancient Egypt. Anything that is a column shape made of one large piece of stone is pre-dynastic, and the dynastic stuff is multi-sections, because the multi-section ones can be done by a number of human workers, but the machining technology involved in doing the ones on the right, that technology was way beyond the capability of the Nabateans or the Romans. And here we see the actual machining marks. You might think that these are chisels, but look how evenly spaced they are. It appears to me more like a rake-like tool. And again, it would have to be, at minimum, diamond-level technology to achieve that. So I think these are ancient machining marks. Diamond technology, as far as we know, was not discovered or created until the late 19th century AD. So these cut marks are at a minimum 2,000 years old, and I would warrant much more than 2,000 years old by a lost civilization. Another chamber. My wife Irene is standing there for scale. This one again is 300,000 cubic feet in size, and it's one of at least 5 that we know of at Petra. And now we're going inside a massive chamber, of which there are, I believe, about 5 at Petra of this size. Now, a rough calculation is that this chamber is 300,000 cubic feet in size. So 300,000 cubic feet of material had to be removed. And then look at the rows of tool marks. On the surface, you can see that they're lined up perfectly, row upon row. And then on the walls, we see rows of tool marks at a 45-degree angle. So these parallel tool marks are almost perfect. I think this was done by machines, not by hand. Just think of the scale, 300,000 cubic feet of material removed. And then the ceiling ones, once again, beautifully parallel tool marks. Hard to determine how many tools were used at one time, and how did they get up that high to do it? They could have made scaffolding possibly, but... And there we have the transition from the ceiling to the wall with the 45-degree angle tool marks. And finally, we get to the very end. And this is very similar looking to the treasury, but look how simple the design is. You don't see the fine detail work. You see triangular shapes and even curved shapes and circles. And again, a massive chamber that could be 100,000 plus cubic feet in size. And so the possibility that this was done by a relatively primitive culture with steel chisels is totally impossible. So you'd think that that would be the extent of Petra, but at the end of our trip, our day trip, we were told that the next morning we were going to another location called Little Petra. So you can see the same kind of simple ornamentation. We have these triangle shapes, circles, really quite simple in comparison to what the treasury looks like. But obviously the same hand was at work here than was at work at Petra proper. So we walk in, again on the left-hand side, you see solid columns carved out of the bedrock, lots of these chambers showing extreme weathering. And this is inside of one of the smaller chambers. Again, it's not that small. I would say it's at least 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet in size. And there are smoke marks and soot marks because they have been used as habitations up to actually the present day. But then we look in detail, and again we're seeing these vertical machining marks, especially inside the chambers because they were protected from the weathering of the outside. But here we were able to see 2 or 3 different styles of machine marks. This is relatively rough. And then a staircase carved into the bedrock going up to upper levels. And more of these weathered openings to chambers. This is the same material. It is quartzite. Again, you can see these columns made out of one single piece. In fact, cut into the bedrock itself. And there, more chambers as we walk down through the complex of Little Petra. To some degree, the weathering at Little Petra is more excessive than it is at Petra proper. And that's why going back will be important, because one trip there is not enough to fully understand what it is you're looking at. That's why I try to go to these locations as many times as possible, because the more you visit, the more your eye picks up on detail. The first trip is always overwhelming because you're looking at the grand scale of everything, but over the course of visits you start to see the more subtle elements and aspects. That's why I've been to Egypt 6 times so far. We make a yearly pilgrimage there to learn more. I've been to Machu Picchu in Peru 68 times, and other locations in Peru I've been to more than 100 times. There's always something more to learn as you visit. And here inside, once again, you see these striations, which is evidence of machine marks. Otherwise, how could a human being of that scale get up to the higher levels? There are no trees in the area to make scaffolding out of, and also the ceilings show the exact same balanced marks, evenly spaced marks of tools capable of efficiently penetrating a quartzite surface. And this shows you the ceiling. So you can see the ceiling has the same striation marks, cutting marks as here, perfectly spaced machining marks. The idea that these were chisels being done by hand, you would have to see some mistakes involved because of the different hardnesses of the surfaces, but we see very even patterning. So I think that's definitely done by a machine. So again, inside, some pretty rough tool marks, but again, evenly spaced, and here even taking a turn. So coming down and moving to the left. So that would indicate, I think, a handheld device rather than some kind of machine attached to a base that would ride up and down and do the cutting. So that's kind of curious. That's the second type of cutting mark that we saw. The other one looked very much more like it was a machine attached to some kind of contraption that could move up and down. But this indicates possibly a handheld tool, but unlikely a hand tool, rather a handheld machining tool. And then there over on the left, you can see more of the machine marks. Over there, more different patterns. And then very fine machining marks that you can see there. So that's the third style of tool mark. That, I think, is the finishing tool that was used. So you have a larger claw-like mechanism cutting away, especially the insides of the chambers. Just to re-emphasize, there are, I think, 5 chambers, each of which have an internal volume of 300,000 cubic feet, and hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller ones. And then the fine tooling done. Luckily, this had an overhang, so it was protected from the weathering, and that was on the way back out of Petra.
Now, you're likely acquainted with Petra itself, Petra proper, and that is located about a half-hour drive from Little Petra and was clearly made by the same civilization. Now, when we got there, we were told, would you like to see a well? So, of course, we said sure, but we were shocked when we were actually able to go through this locked door and see the scale of this quote-unquote well. Now you can see the tool marks there on the wall, exactly the same as what we see in Petra, a series of pointed chisels, it would appear, and it's just the sheer scale of this reservoir carved into the bedrock, which is quite astonishing. Absolutely massive, and could contain thousands upon thousands of gallons of water. The question is, who made it and how? So there you can see the census scale with the pointing finger. Absolutely vast, and it's one of those surprise things that you have no idea exists until you get there with a local guide. And here we are in another one of the chambers. But here on the ceiling you can see very fine tool work. Parallel rows of these pointed chisel marks. These look more like machine marks to me than the previous ones we saw, and which you can see here. Very even, evenly spaced, even penetration. So I think an example of lost ancient high technology.
And so that is my exploration. Well worth visiting if you're in the Middle East area at all. It's quite easy to get to Jordan from Egypt or from Israel. And so absolutely one of the wonders of the ancient world, and far more complicated in terms of its history and construction than most academics will tell you. So about 3.5 hours drive from Beirut, we find the quarry, which is limestone of Baalbek. And you can see automatically that very large stones have been removed from this limestone quarry. And you can even see the fact that the quarry is very ancient because of the weathering patterns on the stone. This quarry was solely used in the first place by the Romans when they occupied the area. However, what standard archaeology cannot explain is this. This is called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and it weighs 1,200 tons. And as we look a little bit closer, you can see that the Stone of the Pregnant Woman is still attached to the bedrock. So something happened at Baalbek in the ancient past, causing work to stop. And that's something that we find here, and we find at other ancient locations such as in Egypt, Peru, Bolivia, etc. Now here again you see the sense of scale. That is me and Yusuf Awiyan at the far end of the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. And also notice all of the ancient weathering patterns that you see on the surface. This gives you a side view of it. And again, with a number of people that are located on top of it. The quarry is privately owned, and that allows us to examine the stone of the pregnant woman and other aspects of the quarry in quite fine detail. Now this is at least 1,200 tons, and recent excavations show that there are possibly larger ones underneath it. Block of limestone.
Biggest rock in the world, eh?
One of them. This has been misidentified as possibly being a work of the Romans. Now the Romans built on top of the megalithic constructions at Baalbek, but there's no way they had the technology, tools, or probably even inclination to try to quarry the largest stone that would ever have been done in the Roman Empire, here, somewhat in the middle of nowhere in relation to Rome itself. So what we're looking at is a megalithic work predating the Romans, the Greeks, and the Egyptians by probably thousands of years, by an unknown civilization that clearly had some type of what we would call lost ancient high technology capability. So we're actually in the quarry itself here, and you can see the tool marks and the grayness, so you see a lot of weathering on this surface. This is the very recent, as in less than 6 months ago, removal of material. And you see those interesting, almost crisscross cutting marks, as well as along the bottom of this block, there's a continuous line that goes around it, as if there was another kind of tool attempting to be used to separate this block from the bedrock itself. And underneath, an even larger one that they were trying to extract. And we also have these test holes where they were testing for the integrity of the stone itself. So this is another massive block of at least 1,000 tons as I crawl uphill in the quarry across the street. Of course, the whole thing was a quarry, and you can see where later cultures were trying to cut smaller pieces from the mega block. And it is possible that originally it was part of this massive limestone outcrop and then was cut and fell in its present position. But the question from there is, why did the work stop? Why did they not manage to either break it into pieces or move it, as they did 3 others, to the actual site of Baalbek, which is at least a mile or 2 in that direction? And here, this gives true evidence of the fact that the stone of the pregnant woman was never moved from its location. It was still being worked on when there was some kind of reason for stoppage of activity. And my theory is that it was an ancient cataclysm approximately 12,000 years ago. So that's 10,000 years before the presence of the Romans in the area. And once again, that's what we see in many locations. Conventional archaeology tells us that it was one culture that did all of the work, but what we see is that the ancient megalithic sites were found by the famous cultures such as the Romans, and they simply utilized the stone that was there and did their own constructions. And here, once as well, you see the furrowing marks at the bottom, and there is the presence of a crack in the lower surface just above their heads. That crack may have been part of the process of the cutting of the stone, or it may have been a natural flaw that was found, and maybe that's why the stone of the pregnant woman was never completed. And once again, the great thing about the quarry is that you're allowed complete access to the entire area, and so that allows us to look at the features of such things as the stone of the pregnant woman in very fine detail, Notice also how on the left-hand side, the soil has been removed, and on the right-hand side, it is still present. So it could very well be that the buildup of soil was proof, or is proof to us today, of the great antiquity of this stone. Again, we theorize that this work in this specific photograph was not done by the Romans, but it was something discovered by the Romans. So now we're at the Baalbek temple location, and what we're looking at the bottom is one stone that weighs 1,000 tons and was successfully put into place. And notice the much smaller stones that are above. So what we can see in this picture is, again, that the Romans found this giant block in place and they used it as a foundation, and then above that they put smaller stones, not very tightly fitting. And here it becomes even more grand because there are 3 1,000-ton blocks in a row, very tightly fitting, no mortar, no gap, and above and to the right we see the cruder and later work of the Romans. The full story of ancient Baalbek requires that you visit both the temple complex and also the quarry. So here you see incredible destruction. This is Roman work that was destroyed by invading peoples over the course of history. Like many locations in Europe and Asia, you've had wave after wave of destructive forces coming in. And that's the sad thing about these beautiful ancient places, is that we see more destruction than we see the construction. But this photograph offers us a subtle clue. The pillar in the foreground is made of granite, whereas most of the construction of Baalbek is limestone from the quarry. We see that granite is also located here. So the question is, where did the granite come from? And luckily we brought a geologist with us from Canada, and she had just been with us in Egypt, so she was able to figure out that the granite of Baalbek was probably from the Aswan quarry located in southern Egypt. And the Aswan quarry is 1,000 miles away. So that's curious, and that's also something that we see in other ancient locations. The stone isn't necessarily from the present locality, but can have been brought from hundreds of miles away. So questions automatically arise: how was the stone moved from that exotic location? And why was it important to bring the granite all the way from Aswan? So as we explore the complex at Baalbek, again we see very massive stonework. This again is likely from the megalithic period, which is pre-Roman. And then here, again, the foundation appears to be megalithic with smaller stones on top. And then on the upper right-hand side, you see granite columns that have been reconstructed. And now we're going to walk into the complex of Baalbek itself. It's huge in scale, and so a visit there is much more intriguing than simply seeing photographs or videos, because being in the presence of something of this complexity and antiquity raises lots of questions, both in terms of ancient engineering, and very much makes us ask whether academics have the full story. And from what you'll see, they have not fully described the antiquity and complexity at Baalbek. So here, for example, as you saw in previous photographs, you saw sections of granite columns, but what this shows us is the bottom part, which is still intact. And the surfaces here are perfectly smooth, perfectly polished, and this column is perfectly round. So that tells us originally it was between 15 and 20 feet tall and was made of one piece of stone. The only way that could have been achieved would be on a giant lathe, and the technology to be able to shape granite to this fineness and high polish was only developed once we had diamond tool technology. And that didn't occur until the late 19th century AD. So not only was it impossible for the Romans to have constructed this, but literally these 300 ancient columns had to have been found by the Romans and then reused. So this again shows you quite clear evidence that the columns themselves, all 300 of them in granite, were turned on ancient lathes. We don't actually have this technology today, or if we do, it's very recent. But if you go back 200 years, these could not have been made, and you go back 2,000 years, and there is no way they could have been made by the Romans. And once again, the detail. You see the smooth surfaces, and this indicates lost ancient high technology at Baalbek in Lebanon. And once again, all of this granite, 300 columns being at least 15 feet, if not 20 feet tall, each was originally one piece of stone. All of them came from Aswan, which is 1,000 miles away. So how many ships would that have taken? And how would they have been transported from the quarry in southern Egypt all the way up the Nile to the Mediterranean and then to the site of Baalbek? And again, with a sense of scale, you have a number of people in the upper left-hand area, and they are walking across stones in a row, each of which weighs 800 tons. And then you see the smaller work above that. The smaller work above is the work by the Romans. The foundational stones of 800-ton blocks each is the work of the earlier and more mysterious megalithic builders. And this just shows you once again the sense of scale. How would 800-ton blocks have been moved from the quarry at Baalbek even just 1 mile to this location? The idea that tree trunks were used is highly unlikely because these blocks would have crushed any wooden roller that was put underneath them. Also, the terrain is not flat, so they would have had to have been pushed up and down hills. And here we have column sections weighing in at least 50 tons apiece, and there Stephen Mailer is pointing to a drill hole. That's a perfectly round drill hole. Could that have been done by the Romans in order to connect the different sections of the columns together? Possibly. But what we see are the surfaces are completely and perfectly flat, almost laser flat. And this just once again re-emphasizes the sense of scale. So of course that's me standing next to a section of a giant column. And this is where it gets fuzzy, because in a lot of cases we'll see profound difference between the megalithic work and the later, in this case, Roman work. But in this case, are the giant sections megalithic, or are they amazing works by the Romans? That I still can't figure out. But this shows you, again, incredibly flat surfaces. We see no errors in the work. Normally the work of human sculptors or stonemasons, you will see errors. You'll see slight indentations or slight protrusions based on the fact that the tool technology they had, which was likely iron or possibly steel, once in a while they would make an error of some kind. But in the case of where I'm looking right now, that surface is as close to perfection as is possible. And once again, there are many, many of these stones in the foundation at the Baalbek religious area. I would say there are at least 20 to 30 to possibly even 40 stones locked in place at 800 to possibly 1,000 tons. And then contrast that with the work of the Romans in the background. A very great architectural and engineering achievement, but this work is humanly possible, and the other work is possibly not the work of humanity. We don't know who the ancient megalithic builders were. Were they so-called Atlanteans? Were they aliens? Were they an unknown culture that simply disappeared? That is something that we are presently working on. This is Roman work. Again, you see smaller stones, you see artwork, you see arches, you see surface decoration. But what's intriguing are the two columns, because those two columns are the granite. The one on the left-hand side was broken into sections and then rebuilt during the Roman time period, and then the one on the right is still a single piece of stone. So that is one of the only pre-Roman works in granite that is still in place. And again, at least 15 to 20 feet tall, and had to have been turned on a massive lathe. And this is simply a detailed shot. We don't know if that's modern cutting or if it's ancient cutting. That again is why we have to return to Baalbek in the future to study the area more. We are among the few researchers who look at this ancient location in such fine detail and obviously question the fact that the Romans could not have been responsible for all of the work done. And again, just to emphasize the fine work of the Romans in limestone, which is relatively soft. And in contrast, the ancient cutting marks in granite. To emphasize hardness, limestone is about 3 to 3.5 in hardness out of 10, with 10 being diamond, and granite is 7 out of 10. So the only technology we know of that can cut granite efficiently is diamond technology. And again, what these ancient cut marks were from, are they modern? Were they done prior to this being made a World Heritage Site? We do see some rust marks, so that indicates possible steel technology, but these are mysterious aspects of Baalbek that, as far as I can tell, academics and specifically archaeologists do not want to look at. We also went to another location called Byblos. And Byblos is located on the Mediterranean in Jordan. It is present in the Bible, and Byblos, I believe, translates as meaning book, and that is where our term Bible comes from. So this is probably my favorite location on Earth because it's likely the most mysterious. It's an aerial view of what is called Puma Punku, located near Lake Titicaca in the highlands of Bolivia, 13,000 feet above sea level. And academics cannot properly explain who built it, why and how it was built. So again, with an aerial view by drone, you see these very large blocks of stone. We have two types of stone located at Puma Punku. One is red sandstone, the quarry for which is located about 8 miles away to the west. And then the gray stone is called andesite, and the quarry for it is about 55 miles to the northeast on top of a volcano. Now, academics insist, or at least most do, that all of this work was done by the Bronze Age Tiwanaku culture about 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. But again, emphasizing Bronze Age culture, the sandstone is relatively soft, but the andesite is very hard. And you cannot shape andesite with bronze tools. And there's no evidence that there were ever many bronze tools in this location. So here you can see where some of the excavation was done. They only dug down about 2 feet. And you can see all of the shattered stone. And I think what happened here was that there was a giant cataclysm that occurred about 12,000 years ago, and a tsunami from Lake Titicaca to the north simply swept out or swept up a lot of mud from Lake Titicaca and literally buried Puma Punku. So when the Tiwanaku civilization appeared about 2,000 years ago, they didn't even know that Puma Punku was there, but they did occupy Tiwanaku, which is right next door. The construction there is of larger stones, and so these were protruding from the mud, and they used this as their ceremonial center. And what you're looking at next to me are 4 of the famous H blocks on the right-hand side of where I'm standing. And each one of those is of a different shape and size. So the idea that they were poured into molds is not correct. And the idea that they were made by the Tiwanaku culture is also not correct. So we're talking about a location super ancient and made originally using lost ancient high technology.
Esto está volviéndose loco en diferente. Hay lugares que no se mueve nada.
Está así. Es que tiene que ser así.
Sí, sí. Les quiero una foto con Brien. No tenemos aquí ni una.
This is one of the most intriguing stones at Puma Punku. And I'll film the actual stone afterwards. But what we're reading here, this is the base microtesla reading of 23 or 24. As I go in close to the stone, 27, 30, 39, so not much difference. Then it drops down to 17. As I turn the corner, 50, 65, and as I pass by the vertical cut, it's at 100. And then as I pass by that vertical slit, it immediately drops down to base. So this particular spot here is especially magnetic in alignment with the groove. We also took calipers here, and these holes, which are all the same diameter, are perfectly spaced. And this groove is perfectly aligned to the edge of this surface going down. And the flatness is believed by some who have measured it to possibly be within 2/10,000ths of an inch of being laser perfect.
If you take a look at the magnetic needle, it stays horizontal and level here, but then when you bring it over to this point here, the magnetic field is so strong that it's causing the needle to dip, and there's an angulation of that needle, so it just kind of gives you some information about the magnetic field that's being generated by this stone. The magnetic field in this one is different.
I'm now going to film with the Gauss meter across the face of one of the H blocks.
So that's pretty amazing that on the outside left edge of the H block, the Gauss meter was reading over 400. And then when it got into the center of the H block, it went down to like 10, 20, or 30, and then back up, and to the right, it goes back up over 400. So is that the nature of the andesite stone itself, or is it the actual shape that is causing this quite dramatic alteration in the magnetometer's registration?
This is a close-up of 4 of the H blocks. Again, we physically measured them, and some are more than an inch wider than the others. So each one had to be individually crafted. There appear to have only ever been 8 of them, because much of Puma Punku was moved to other locations, such as the little town of Teotihuacan in the background, and used in wall construction, starting most likely in colonial Spanish times, but we see no evidence of any other H blocks, and that's what makes them so mysterious. And here, again, we see the H blocks, and what's curious is the one that I'm standing behind was never completed, because with the other ones, all the surfaces are perfectly flat and perfect joinery, but the one that I'm standing behind, the upper niche and lower niche, the corners are rounded. So it appears 2 different types of high-tech tool was used, one for doing the basic shaping, and then another one for doing the final flat surfaces. And hopefully you can see that there. With the one on the left-hand side, you can see there's a false door shape in the upper niche, missing from the one on the right, and the same thing occurs in the lower niche on the left. There's a false door shape, and no such shape on the right. So the one on the left was completed, the one on the right was never completed, and that indicates that work suddenly stopped. Mysteriously, we find the same phenomenon when we go to Egypt, and also some of the other constructions in places like the highlands of Peru. You see major projects under construction, and then suddenly a work stoppage. And I believe this was all the result of an ancient cataclysm from 12,000 years ago. There's abundant evidence that there was a global cataclysm that occurred at that time, and that corresponds to the rapid end of the last ice age. So that's why people call constructions like this pre-diluvian, as in pre-flood. Here we look at the backs of the H blocks. Complex extrusions. There's no evidence that these actually interlocked with anything else. And the same thing with the ones on the front. Some people think that there is a interlocking mechanism that stones fitted into these slots to make a 3-dimensional, very tight-fitting structure. But if you want to call these the female stones, there is no evidence of any male stones. So this location is more complicated than most people can realize. And again, to some degree, you can see that the stone on the right is at least slightly higher than the one on the left. So there's no way that these were all made in a mold, as some people state. But each one was, I wouldn't say handcrafted, but I would say individually crafted. And the slots of the H blocks are not perfectly 90-degree angles. They're actually more like a dovetail shape. And that's why some people think that a dovetail would lock into it. But if so, where are the dovetails? Almost all of the stone that was removed from Puma Punku and Teotihuacan was regular rectangular blocks useful in the construction of houses and other buildings. The H blocks are such a strange design that trying to find a place to integrate them into your construction would be difficult, and fortunate for us, that's why they were left behind. And then here we see all sorts of different and strange indentations. We see no actual artwork involved at Puma Punku, just geometric shapes and geometric designs. What we'll see at later, or in later photos, is we'll see Tiwanaku itself, and there you will see artwork, surface carving. And that was done by the Tiwanaku culture between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. They simply took advantage of the flat surfaces and decided to put artwork. But whoever built Puma Punku, they were simply pragmatic. And here again, these interesting cross shapes, 2 levels of indentation. Some of them are heavily eroded, and other ones are actually quite crisp. If the surface of the stone was found upside down, then you would have had almost perfect preservation, and the other side exposed to the weather, extreme erosion. So some of them look like they're brand new, whereas others look like they're incredibly old. Here, 2 more of the H blocks. They're not in their original location. 4 of the other ones are over on the left-hand side. And again, they are the great puzzle. They weren't building blocks. They seem to be magnetic as well in nature. We've moved magnets back and forth across the fronts of the H blocks and also into the recesses, and the compasses tend to go absolutely wild. I'm trying to figure out what the pattern is, and so that's why I've been here probably 55 times and will continue going a number of times a year in order to unlock the secret of how Puma Punku functioned and why is there this variable magnetism. This is a gate of some kind. There were in fact 4, barely tall enough to allow a human to walk through. And then where you see the etch carving on the top, that was done by the Tiwanaku culture. Again, they found perfectly flat surfaces and decided to etch some of them with usually birdman designs. And then here we have the excavation, and you can see that some of the ancient stones are protruding from the wall. So it's quite clear that a lot of the construction at Puma Punku is still underground, but the archaeologists refuse to do any more digging. They say, we've dug down 2 feet and that's all there is. But there has to be much more to it because ground penetrating radar has been done here by independent researchers, and they have found that there are chambers underneath Puma Punku. But will they ever be excavated? We'll have to wait and see. And then these are where clamps used to be. So different shapes and sizes of clamps that would lock different stones together. There is my foot for reference in terms of size. The clamps that were found were made of bronze, and it's very difficult to smelt bronze at 13,000 feet elevation, especially if you're a relatively crude culture. So it's possible that the bronze clasps were made by a much older civilization with the capability of melting bronze with ease. And these are more examples of these clamps and what are actually called keystone cuts. So again, these were used to lock the stones together, whether that was for earthquake proofing or maybe for the movement of energy through the stone. Since the stone is magnetic, it could be that, and actually full of iron as well, and quartz crystal, it could be that energy moved through the stones in original construction, and that the bronze clamps helped to facilitate the moving of the energy. And then these really interesting drill holes, perfectly evenly spaced, even in diameter. They had to have been done by some kind of power drill, but no such thing existed at the time of the Tiwanaku culture, And also, it would take at least hardened steel to be able to penetrate the stone in this way. Also, the grooves are perfectly flat and perfectly even, as if done with a powered router. And other strange shapes like this. You have the circle, which is more or less perfectly round but eroded. And then the square notches are actually tapered. They're wider in the bottom than they are at the top, as if something was meant to lock into them. But unfortunately, Puma Punku has been pillaged over the course of 1,000 years or more. In fact, when the Tiwanaku culture appeared 2,000 years ago, they immediately started to use the stones at Tiwanaku for reconstruction. So they moved a lot of the stones and built their own buildings. So there is absolutely no record or concept of what it originally looked like. But the foundations are perfectly level, within 1 degree. That takes some level of sophistication. In order to create a vertically level surface, all you need is something like a plumb bob. But in order to create a flat surface, that requires some degree of technology. Of course, we have things like levels, but it's doubtful that the Tiwanaku culture had anything like that, not even what we call a bubble level or anything. So this is an indication that the foundations of Puma Punku were found in place and were utilized by the Tiwanaku people as foundation blocks to build stuff on top of. We also find that some of the red sandstone blocks have melted surfaces, that the surfaces were turned basically into glass, and that requires a minimum of 1,000 degrees Celsius or possibly even 2,000 degrees Celsius, and that is much higher than a standard campfire or open flame. So could that be evidence of an ancient cataclysm, of plasma from the sun striking locations like this, basically making them explode? Could be. That's what we're doing in terms of further research. And this is more of a close-up. You can see that the surface of the stone is in fact vitrified and glassy. We also have these giant foundation blocks. The largest of the sandstone ones, there's one that is estimated to weigh 131 tons. And again, the quarry is 8 miles away, up and over that mountain range. So how were they moved when no indigenous trees grow in the area? You have nothing to use as rollers. You couldn't pull them, so how were they moved across the landscape? So this is a view of the large foundation blocks. The one directly behind is the one that weighs 131 tons. They do look like that they originally were interlocking and all lined up, but some of them have sunken into the ground. Again, that could have been result of an ancient cataclysm liquefying the ground. And this is the profile of one of the giant blocks with these strange niches in it, function unknown, but again, perfectly flat surfaces and right angles, as if something was meant to lock in, but we can't find where the stones are that did that. And here, the level shows the flatness of the surface, the fact that this one at least, is still almost perfectly level. And if you didn't have the pitting as the result of all the weathering, these surfaces would be almost laser perfect, flat. That is not something you can achieve with hand tools. And this just shows you the flatness again of the surface. Clearly, this was machined. Also more possible charring of surfaces here on the gray andesite. Again, possible evidence of solar plasma striking the surfaces. That is the theory of Dr. Robert Schoch. We also find elongated skulls. Now, the cranial volume of this elongated skull is larger than a normal human being, probably 25% larger. So that is a genetic characteristic. And one of the other curiosities about Puma Punku. You have this element of the existence of early builders who don't appear to have been Homo sapiens sapiens, and that's just another one of the mysteries of this ancient place. Also, more evidence of there having been some cataclysmic event here with bones that have been shattered to pieces. This is not a simple cemetery, but looks like a place where major devastation occurred. Maybe it wasn't 12,000 years ago, but it was almost 100% sure prior to the time of the Tiwanaku people. And now we're moving to Tiwanaku itself, and that is located right next to Puma Punku. Elevation 3,700 or 870 meters. So an aerial view of what is called the Kalasasaya complex, and unfortunately it was rebuilt in the 1960s, and so that creates great confusion because it doesn't tell us exactly what it originally looked like. This is an interpretation of what it looked like. And another aerial view, and here again you see reconstruction of what is called the Akapana Pyramid, and it was a 7-level pyramidal structure, again partially reconstructed, but it also appears that it too was completely covered by an ancient wave of mud, was found by the Tiwanaku people, partially excavated, and then used as their central ceremonial site. And another aerial view of most of Tiwanaku, the Kalasasaya complex on the left, and then what's called the Sunken Temple in the middle. There's probably a lot as well buried underground, but excavations are not frequent and not very extensive at Tiwanaku for unknown reasons. But here we have a model of what the Akapana pyramid likely looked like in the foreground. You see 7 levels with a Chakana-shaped pool in the middle, and then the Kalasasaya complex above, and to the above right, the sunken temple. And so here's Antonio Portugal showing you what the Akapana likely looked like originally. Again, some theories are that it was a place for refining metals, that the ore mixed with water was pumped on top, and then it went through a series of tight-fitting canals, and that actually was what the function of the sunken temple was for, was as a collecting pool to collect the metals and silt and water. And naturally, if this was done in a controlled nature, then the gold and other metals would settle to the bottom. Then you would pull the drain plugs, get rid of all the water, clean out the silt, and then collect the metals for refining. But that is simply one theory. And this, again, is the symbol that appears over and over again at Tiwanaku and Puma Punku. It's like a false door with a double lintel, and we see that over and over again. It's the only major example of so-called art that we see from the pre-Tiwanaku period, and that, I think, is almost like a maker's mark of some kind. Very mysterious, and likely not hand-carved, but machined into the surface. And once again at Tiwanaku, like at Puma Punku, we have this repeating design of this false door with double lintel, and the surfaces of the stone almost perfectly flat. And again, magnetic anomalies, not with the red sandstone, but with the gray andesite. Some stones are more sensitive than others. The ones that are flat tend to not have too much of magnetic anomaly, but the ones which have the complicated angles, the magnetic anomalies go very wild. And so that's the main part of my research at Puma Punku and Tiwanaku now, is the magnetic anomalies. And this is Patricia Awian, and she's touching a piece of stone that we had sampled or tested and it's 37% copper. So that could be an example of an ingot that was created in the early times at Teotihuacan, Puma Punku as the initial material for further processing. So once again, the idea that the original function of Teotihuacan and Puma Punku was some kind of metal refining place. And here is a close-up of what that stone is. Again, 37 to 38% pure copper, which is not normal. And another piece being held by Anthony. Again, this piece is very high in copper content. We only found about half a dozen of these on location. The rest may have literally just been taken away and been refined, maybe even during colonial Spanish times, maybe even incorporated into the structures of local buildings in the town. And once again, showing you the incredible flatness. And once again, these square shapes are wider at the bottom than they are at the top, as if something was meant to lock inside. And these interesting semicircular shapes, they look like they were done by some kind of machine. Are these 1/2 of a perfect circle? We've never been able to find the other half. So again, just an anomalous feature whose function we haven't been able to yet figure out. And once again, this shows you that we don't have perfect 90-degree angles. This is at Teotihuacan, but what we have are dovetail shapes. So much more complicated than creating a perfect 90-degree angle. Each side is exactly the same. And so it does look like something was meant to interlock in the stone, but we can't find the pieces that could have done that. And there is a photograph I took of excavations being done 3 years ago. And you can see they're uncovering quite giant stone blocks. Technically, I wasn't supposed to take pictures, but I wanted to take a record of the fact that there are large stones underneath Teotihuacan and Puma Punku that are being hid from the public. And here is another example of that. Not revealing the past, but concealing it. Also, this is off to the side, and this is almost a watertight shaft that goes down into the ground. I don't know why this hasn't been filled in, but this is likely from the very earliest high-tech phase of construction. All the stone fitting together almost perfectly, and so almost perfectly that this will fill up with water if it rains. And then we have these two stones, again with these cutting areas in the center. Here seen lying down about 3 years ago, and then suddenly 2 years ago, they're seen standing up. So they're still manipulating the stones and moving them around, destroying the actual historical record of this location. This was probably done for the public to make it easier to look at them, but it destroys the actual historical record. That's why it's important to keep going back to see how the site changes over time. And here again, you see them standing upright. You don't see, actually we will see the detail here. The front surfaces are almost perfectly flat, and then the indentations, the angles or corners are actually rounded over. So like at Puma Punku, this is where a tool went in and did the initial cutting out of the depression or depressed area, and then another machine was to come and cut the corners, but work was interrupted for some reason. And this very strange shape, you can see it's quite complex in design, and the most intriguing thing about it is that if you get up close to it, you see this very complex series of curves. You have sharp, flat sharp corners, very flat surfaces, and then this arch that goes in. It's a compound curve that would be very difficult to create in the first place. So what its original function is, was it part of a water movement system that is presently, again, unknown, and why Tiwanaku and Puma Punku are so mysterious. Then we also have these ancient water channels. Look at the grooves, especially here. You see almost the cupping of grooves. Those appear to me to have done by a machine. And I think this was recycled from the much older time period, original function unknown, but during the Tiwanaku period, made to move water out of the center of the ceremonial complex to the outside. And again, more grooves that appear to be machine made, perfectly spaced, same width in between, and a gentle cupping. And this feature, which is called the Temple of the Moon, or actually the Gate of the Moon, that originally was one piece of stone, so it would have weighed probably 7 tons. And once again, the quarry 55 miles, or about 80 kilometers away. And this giant chunk, again weighing probably 10 tons, it looks like it was thrown a great distance, and there it is lying in the ground. And so that's what makes Tiwanaku and Puma Punku so mysterious. There are no standard academics studying it to this very day. The only one that did significant work was a man called Arthur Poznansky, who spent 50 years studying the site. And he dated Puma Punku and Tiwanaku at 17,000 years based on solar alignments, the precession of the equinox. So I'm not sure if standard archaeology will ever catch up to the more recent research that we're doing, but that's not really a problem, because if they don't do the work, then we will. Surprisingly, to this very day, there's still ancient ceremonies that are being conducted, such as here at the ancient and huge site of Teotihuacan, located about 2 hours outside of Mexico City. So when we went there on tour, we were actually able to hire a native group to perform ceremonies before we went into Teotihuacan. Now at the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, again, the staircase is made of cut blocks. And yet the rest of the construction is really quite simplistic, except for those large cut stones there. This is a typical staircase located at Teotihuacan of mixed material. And one very large stone here that clearly was originally used in the construction, but now isn't. So here again, you can see kind of rubble on the right-hand side, but then finely finished blocks of basalt, especially up in here to the left, locking into place. And then the faces that are carved are likely older pieces of stone that were shaped by the later cultures. So again, very subtle compared to what we see in the more classic megalithic sites, but still present. And this is called the Temple of the Moon. And as we progress, we'll see again that parts of the central staircase appear to be older with tight fitting basalt stone. And I think that was found in place, and then the rebuilding happened thousands of years afterwards. So this is what I'm trying to show you. You see the staircase, it has been repaired, but the blocks appear to have been cut, possibly by machines. The cultures of this area did not have any real bronze technology or metals of any kind, and basalt is quite a hard stone, so how this was shaped by them appears to be not the case. They seem to have been inherited. And again, compare the construction of the staircase with the much rougher construction on the right-hand side. The whole area is volcanic stone, so it would be relatively easy for a large group of people to be able to find enough material to build these monuments. But again, I think you have two different levels and periods of construction. And here's another example. This woman is sitting on a basalt block that must weigh at least 2 tons, and it's up on top of the first course of the staircase. And so that's very anomalous in comparison to the other material that we see here. That clearly seems to have been shaped, and I think it's an older aspect of the construction. And in Mexico City itself, unfortunately, Tenochtitlan, which was the original name by the Aztecs of Mexico City, the Spanish completely destroyed the ancient Aztec capital. They tore all of the ancient temples down and reconstructed them in the form of churches. So unfortunately, most of what's left of Tenochtitlan is rubble, more or less, and because of earthquake activity as well over the course of time, these temples could be very, very ancient, but an earthquake would cause damage and then reconstruction. But what's intriguing is this is a reconstruction of one of the major temples of Tenochtitlan, and you can see different layers of construction and even air gaps in between. So that would be a very complex form of construction where one temple would be built, and then over the course of time, another would be built on top, and then on top, and then on top. So this is probably at least 4 different levels of construction, and this is what that temple would have looked like at the time of the Spanish conquest. But it's when you're looking at the rubble and the different artifacts that you see huge pieces of stone like this put on display. Where it originally was, we don't know. But again, that's a giant block of basalt. And to me, the surfaces, at least some of them, look machined. So it's what we call an out-of-place artifact. We don't know where it was originally located. We don't know where the quarry is that it was taken from. And so I think that's something that the Aztec found in this location and then utilized it in the construction. And then with the destruction by the Spanish conquistadors and others that came later, it's quite possible that this was so big and the stone is very hard that they decided, rather than using it or breaking it up into pieces for church construction, it was just left off to the side. But that leaves it to us as an interesting artifact. Then you have this giant sculpture of Tlaloc, weighing upwards of possibly 100 tons. It was found outside of Mexico City, lying face down. A huge piece of basalt stone. The circles below the eyes and nose appear to be drill holes, but that's a possibility. And it was moved in the 20th century to Mexico City, and that required a massive flatbed truck with multiple wheels to move it. So how it was created in the first place is unknown, because the ancient people of this area, the ones we know of, only had Stone Age technology. Basalt is about 7 out of 10 in terms of hardness, and so you would require tools harder than that, possibly corundum or even diamond, to be able to efficiently shape it. The hands are broken off and the toes are broken off. So this is one of those intriguing ancient artifacts in Mexico. One of the few that's of a scale like this that we have to observe today. And then when we go to the Jalapa Museum, which is located moving into the Olmec country around the Yucatan part, jungle of Mexico, again, these amazing artifacts, these lower ones here, that are perfectly circular and had to have been done by machines. We were lucky to have an engineer with us from the United States who was retired. He had been a manufacturing engineer all of his life. And when I showed them to him, unfortunately, most people are impressed by giant objects. This is a museum that has a lot of the big stone Olmec heads, and this was in a very small case, but my eye tends to look for anomalies. And so when I saw these, I called David to come over. He looked at them, and I said, David, could these be made by hand? And he said, no, that's impossible. So again, ancient artifacts inherited by the established known cultures, but coming from a very distant time. Next, we're in the jungle of Chiapas, and this is Palenque. Palenque is most famous for, it's the most famous probably of the Mayan sites. It's also one of the most beautiful, and this is where the famous Lord Pacal's tomb is located. That's the building on the left. Unfortunately, it's closed to the public now, and most of the precious artifacts are now in the major museum in Mexico City. But it is one of the most beautiful landscapes. It's almost like a Japanese garden. Only 10 to 15% of it has ever been excavated, so 85% of Palenque is still in the jungle. And again, this is a very subtle sign of possible lost ancient technology, lost ancient civilization. You see the very kind of rough work here, rough stone with volcanic ash as mortar. And then look at the staircase in the middle, and you see that each one of those is a solid block, and there is no mortar. And also some of them have sunken into the ground. So I think that that staircase is original and then was discovered by the Maya, and they constructed their temple complex around that central staircase. And here again, you can see some very massive slabs of limestone and a big staircase on the left, tight-fitting stone. The surface carving was probably done by the Maya because most megalithic sites or megalithic aspects do not have artwork whatsoever. You simply have form and function. The classic example of that would be the Great Pyramid in Egypt, where the interior chambers, the Queen's Chamber, the King's Chamber, and the subterranean chamber have no artwork whatsoever. Whereas when we look at dynastic structures, then we see hieroglyphics absolutely everywhere. So rather than the case being that the ancient Egyptians never got around to doing hieroglyphs or ornamentation inside the Great Pyramid, it's clear that they found the Great Pyramid, and I think that's the case here too. The giant limestone slabs, it's not a hard stone, but especially with the staircase on the left, you see no mortar, it's stone on stone construction, whereas the later phases here, you can see mortar in between the stones, and again, the ornamentation looks fresher than the original surface. We're talking hundreds of years old in terms of the carving, but still the patina of the flat surfaces is darker, indicating it's older. And again, look behind this lady. Again, not huge stones, but this first course, you can see the stones fit very tightly together, whereas right in behind it, on the left, you see much rougher work and lots of the mortar used to fuse it together. So I think this level here is older, and the area behind it is later. Again, Mexico is very subtle that way. When you go to Egypt, it's night and day, and the same thing in parts of Peru and other countries. You see construction that's very easy to understand in terms of how it was made, and then other aspects that look technically almost impossible, even for us in the 21st century. And now we're still at Palenque, and if you look above, you see again relatively small stone rough construction, lots of clay mortar, and then these rather massive slabs, each one of which fits tightly together, but they all show signs of ancient damage. And it could very well be that this work originally was done prior to the time of what we call the ancient cataclysm, which occurred on the planet about 12,000 years ago. So it is possible that some of the ancient sites of Mexico are 12,000 plus years old, and that's what we also believe is the case in, again, Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt, Lebanon, and other locations. So you see how tight-fitting the ancient stonework was. And again, it's all shifted out of place, as if a massive earthquake of some kind has altered the appearance of it. The Maya were not able to move the stones in order to do the repair work, so they were forced to basically leave it the way they found it. And that's good for us, because that shows us that there was at least one ancient cataclysmic event at Palenque a long time ago. And now we're at Uxmal. And Uxmal is interesting because our guide was a native man, and he understands the ancient Mayan language. And so he was able to tell us what the original names of these places was, and also what the translation of the names were. And so Uxmal means built 3 times. And what that tells us is, I think, is that the 3rd time period was likely the later Maya, the 2nd time period was the early Maya, and the 1st time period was the ancient megalithic. We do find megalithic aspects at Uxmal, not here in particular, but the fact that the place is named built 3 times means 3 time periods of construction. And again, it's mildly subtle, but if you look in this area, you see relatively large column sections and then almost rubble-like construction in behind. The main temple here is made of probably millions of stone, but they're all random shapes and sizes glued together with this volcanic mortar. And these stones look like they were cut with saws of some kind, which was not a technology that the Mayan people had. So these stones may have been recycled from an earlier construction and then incorporated into the temple. And here, quite a tight-fitting wall you can see. This could be from the 1st construction time period, and then it may have been repaired. These stones to me look like they have been cut with saws, but then later repair work was done. So it's possible that a massive cataclysm or earthquake damaged or destroyed this temple structure, and then the Maya people found it and they rebuilt it. And now we are at Chichen Itza. And at Chichen Itza, again, the internal material is quite rough, the external material is quite fine. Either the external material was found from an older structure, or they decided to make it look really nice on the exterior, but fill it with rubble. And also at Chichen Itza, again, rough construction here on the left and right, and then very large slabs of stone, limestone, for the staircase. So I think the staircase is original, and then the left and right sides are reconstruction. And this is also in the same area. Notice how uniform some of these cut marks are. I think this was done with ancient saws, and saws were not known to the Zapotec people. So I think they were aspects that were found on location and then reincorporated into the later construction by the Zapotec people. So contrast the flat surfaces with the really rough work here. That can't be the work of the same technicians. And now it gets even more obvious. Look at the size of that stone to the left of my finger. That's about 6 tons. The one below it is about 1 ton. And this is in the same area of Oaxaca at a site called Mitla. And so if you haven't actually visited the place, it's difficult. Again, it's very difficult if you simply look at photographs, say in a search engine, and try to discern what's going on. But since I was physically there, I was able to figure out that the 6-ton block is basalt. And again, the hardness of basalt is 7 out of 10, and that requires at least carborundum or diamond technology. And these people, the Zapotecs, didn't know metals whatsoever. If they did, they maybe had some copper implements, and copper cannot cut basalt. And more recycling. These large columns, they're about 8 to 10 feet tall. There are about 20 of them located at Mitla, and clearly they're from an earlier construction phase of a people who had lost ancient high technology. And then here again, we see very much a contrast in style. Look at the lintels. That stone here weighs at least 6 tons and clearly looks like it was cut by machines, and contrast that with the wall in behind, much rougher. So once again, the Zapotec discovered an ancient megalithic site and then rebuilt it utilizing whatever was at hand. Of course, they would use any giant stones like this in their construction, and then they had to use other rougher material that was found on location. The fine work on top looks like it may have been machined, but in fact it's quite soft limestone, so they could have shaped that, and it's only superficial work. And here too, you see the lintels are very massive, and then the vertical upright areas very crude. And once again, look at the fine shaping of the basalt blocks below, and then the rougher work in between, and then fine basalt work incorporated to some degree in the upper sections. And even in the church, you see rougher work below, and then the recycling of ancient basalt blocks in the construction of the church. And that's also what we find, of course, in places like Mexico City. There are machine marks on the stones in the construction of the many of the churches and other buildings in Mexico City. And the Spanish conquistadors did not have cutting technology at that level. So it's quite possible that Tenochtitlan, which we know of as Mexico City, was constructed originally thousands of years before the Aztecs discovered it. And more massive blocks like this lintel here. Again, it's about 6 tons in weight. And we found the quarry. It's about 2 miles away. And here again, super tight fitting stonework beyond the capability of the Zapotec people. So this section here and below could be the original, and then rougher work above. And more giant blocks incorporated into much cruder construction, here and there. And again, more recycling of stone blocks that were likely cut by saws or other kinds of machines below, and then almost adobe material utilized later above. And again, these stones here do not fit into place in terms of or in relation to the other work that we're looking at. So we're looking again at the recycling of older machined stonework. And for a sense of scale, here's my wife Irene with one of the basalt columns. You can see that it's about 12 feet tall. And the quarry is at least 2 miles away. And me with a 6-ton basalt lintel. Again, contrast the lintel size and shape with the walls underneath it. And in more detail, this is another one. We found about between 10 and 15 of these 6-ton blocks. And that, look at the stone on the left near the bottom. That one is 10 tons. Contrast that with all of the rest of the stonework that you're looking at in this picture. And that is the 10-ton stone block. Somebody at some point tried to cut a section off and basically gave up. That's something that we also see in other ancient locations where a more recent culture would move in, such as the Inca, and they would try to cut, in some cases, some of the stonework that they found and just basically gave up because they didn't have the technology of the original builders. And this is the quarry itself. Some of these may be very ancient cut surfaces. Kind of hard to tell. We will be going back. Anything that's intriguing like this, you really have to go multiple times before you can make a proper assessment of what you're looking at. One trip, there's usually so much ancient activity that's going on that it's hard to get the clear picture. But I think we can definitely state that ancient Mexico is far more complicated than what most academics believe.